So we did a little more research and found a PHP page in Nathan's actual source code that ended up being this, a C99 Mad Shell version 3.0 blog edition. So what this is basically a custom-written PHP page to allow interaction with the system to a degree that's not necessarily intended through a web application server. This particular PHP shell enumerates a bunch of system values. It has the server that's running the web server, Apache. It's got the kernel version. It's got PHP version, PHP functions. This one's actually so automated, it will detect if WordPress is on the system and help you get into WordPress easier. But what a PHP shell does is it basically allows the user or the attacker that uploads it to interact with the system, browse and edit files, upload, delete files, download database, interact with the database. So it's pretty much a GUI for an SSH shell. So that was pretty nasty. Our last example here is Carl Swedberg. Some of you may be familiar, learningjquery.com. He hosted on WordPress. And just an aside, during our migration from his old host, we gained access to over 1,000 different websites. Kind of a testament to not using shared hosting in a sense that a simple misconfiguration in his FTP login allowed us to have access to these other sites. Obviously, we had him report the misconfiguration and went on from there, but his Learning jQuery site got hacked. So being the professional that Carl is, he tried to remove the hack himself. He tried to rectify the problem, but was unsuccessful. And in the spirit of open source, he kind of crowdsourced an answer. So he replaced his website with what you see here. He says, "I'm so sorry, but Learning jQuery has been hacked repeatedly this week, and I need to shut it down until I figure out how to plug all the holes and prevent it from happening again." Then he goes into some details about how the hack happened. There was a file injected, http://.php. Hackers like to use base64 encoding to obfuscate their code and hide their JavaScript. Even after he removed that file, there was some code injected into his footer. It was basically a malware hack. So a little further down, he goes into what he actually tried to resolve this. So he removed any trace of the hack he could find, PHP files, JavaScript functions, all that. He changed pretty much every password that he had control over, his system password, his hosting account password, SSH, WordPress users, his database user, so on and so forth. And then he went to change his table prefixes in WordPress and added authentication tokens to the wp-config.php, some more effective than others. But regardless, he couldn't fix the hack on himself. So we were able to get him over and get him cleaned. But imagine if this was your business. Would you be able to sustain that type of downtime, that type of reputation tarnish? Would your business be able to survive after that? What kind of hit would it take? So how can we protect these guys? The first thing we need to understand is that security is essentially an ecosystem. We've got all these different points of responsibility, things to secure, and you've got your physical network, your applications, your database, your web server, anything down here in the bottom, your managed hosting provider. Any good managed hosting provider is going to handle for you with a firewall, virus protection, IDS, IPS, that kind of stuff. But we're all essentially responsible for our web applications, our websites, and any third-party applications that are installed. But the biggest security vulnerability out of all this isn't mentioned here, and I'll talk about it here on the next slide. It's us. It's the humans. We're always the biggest vulnerability. So we've got all these things we need to do, secure our website, use strong passwords, implement security technologies, but if we don't implement those correctly, or if we're lazy and for whatever reason get complacent, then there's a possibility we could be vulnerable. We're always subject to social engineering as well. So there's a few things we have to realize. The first is security is convenient. The more checks and balances we put in place, the more technologies, the more vetting we do, it's going to take more time. So security is never going to be convenient. When you're choosing a CMS platform, when you're choosing an open source platform to use for your web application, choose a leading CMS. And I don't necessarily mean the most downloaded CMS. I don't mean the most popular CMS. But if you see the CMS X, I'm going to call it, for instance, that's HTML5 and CSS 3.0, and it's got all the cool Ajax and JavaScript in it. It may not necessarily, it may be in beta, it may have just been released. Thousands of open source folks haven't been able to run through the code, and as much as we like to, or as much as we don't like to admit it, development's not necessarily done with security in mind. So it hasn't been vetted from a security standpoint. Use something that's been around for a while. Joomla, WordPress, Drupal, BotX, those things are good examples, simply because they've been around, there have been patches. Bugs have been fixed functionality-wise, but most importantly, there's been security patches, and it's been through the security community a bit. Always stay up to date with your core updates. This is kind of a no-brainer. Core updates contain bug fixes, but they also contain security patches. One thing that I do is I subscribe to all the RSS feeds for the CMSs that I use. They normally post posts regarding updates and change logs for the core updates. Read the change logs, look at the bug fixes, look what was actually fixed in the core update instead of just updating. Most open source CMSs don't necessarily do what we want to out of the box functionality-wise. Sure, it's got a good core functionality, but we all use modules. Most CMSs have good security modules, whether it's a brute force attack type protection, whether it's password complexity requirements. There's even some modules out there that will allow you to kind of audit your file permissions and make sure that everything's set as secure as possible regarding your file permissions. And use a secure hosting provider. We can all go out right now and pay $5 for a millennium of hosting somewhere, but obviously they're not going to be security focused and they're not going to be secure. So use a secure hosting provider, spend the extra cash, and protect yourself and get a hosting provider that's security focused. So we're going to use modules. When we use modules, we need to keep them under control. So like we said, the core CMS or the core open source software is not necessarily going to have all the functionality and security that you want, so there's modules to help you augment that. So when we start installing modules, we're usually very careful about what we install. We vet them, we update them. It's nice and tidy, but as time goes on, it becomes a plug-in party, right? So we end up having like 50, 60 plugins, half of them disabled, half of them not updated. Some of them may be duplicates, but we may be opening ourselves up to more security vulnerabilities than we're aware of when we kind of keep a messy plug-in scenario. So be mindful of that. And when you download your modules, open source, we need to make sure that we download from trusted sources. And what I mean by that is there's nothing to stop a hacker, an attacker, or someone with malicious intent from going to download, I'm going to use WordPress as an example, but the top 10 WordPress plugins. Modifying those, putting in his malicious payload and hosting that on Bob's top 10 WordPress plugins. And every time someone downloads that and installs it, they're basically hacking their site for them. So download only from the developer site, and I usually download from the actual CMS site, Joomla, WordPress, ModX, whoever the case may be, whatever you decide to use. When you download a module, check the bug reports. Check the open bug reports, not necessarily what's been fixed, but what hasn't been fixed. What functionality is not there, what functionality is not working, but most importantly, has anybody identified any kind of security bugs? And this next point is not necessarily speaking to security as much as it is to development. Don't activate 20 plugins at once. I've had customers come to us on countless occasions saying, why does my website run so slow? Why is it going so slow and it used to run so fast? Come to find out they just activated 10 plugins at one time, and it's hard to troubleshoot in that scenario. So be smart when it comes to that. I don't want to offend anybody, but we're all familiar with the three dirty letters, development. Development's good. We wouldn't have any of the nice software we have today without development, but development, like I said, is not normally done with security in mind. There's lots of new functionality that hasn't been tested, that hasn't been vetted. So keep your environment separate when it comes to development and production. There's no need to endanger your production data simply because you want to run your dev and your production environment on the same machine. Obviously, don't install a module if it doesn't support your core version of higher, simply because there might be some deprecated functionality or some functionality has been upgraded to be more secure in that. And then one thing I like to do when I'm installing a module is I like to search Google or Bing or whatever search engine you use for the module name and the word hacked or the module name and the word vulnerability. That's a good way to see if there's any kind of known vulnerabilities or exploits out there for that module. All right, so we talked about your modules. Let's talk about your admin for a little bit. One thing that I don't see enough of, and I'm sure some of you feel the same way, is SSL. It's not just for your shopping carts. Anytime you send information over over a post or even a GET, anytime you send information over the air, if it's not encrypted via SSL, those credentials or that information can easily be snatched out of the air and stolen. It's basically like sending cash in a clear envelope in the mail. It's probably going to get stolen. Configure your htaccess or IIS security for your admin directory. So our admin directories have login forms. Why not configure htaccess or IIS security to prompt for an extra password? It's just another layer of security. It's not always necessary, but it doesn't hurt us either. And never, ever, ever trust your network connection. In fact, here at the conference, good people set up the network. Not everybody here may be good, so there could be someone sniffing every single packet that's in the air. Wi-Fi kind of works as a hub if you know anything about networking. Everybody's wireless right now is coming to my computer, but my computer's smart enough to only accept packets from my IP address. A couple lines of code, I can be accepting every single packet that comes to my computer regardless of whether it's on my network or not, and then later go parse that and grab passwords if I wanted to. So it's very, very easy to sniff Wi-Fi traffic, and ARP poisoning on a wired network basically tricks every computer on the wired network to thinking you're the router, so they're going to route all their traffic through whoever's trying to ARP poison, and they can sniff just as easy as they could on wireless. So use something like a third-party VPN, hidemyass.com, Viper VPN, things like that offer. Basically, it encrypts all your traffic, regardless of whether it's SSL or not, sends it off-site to another machine in a secure network somewhere, but you escape that immediate hostile network, so you're not worried about that. So when it comes to your database, never, ever, ever use your root login. Most of you guys know this. For those that don't, when you get a new database provisioned from a hosting provider, regardless of who the hosting provider is, we're going to give you a root login. That's excellent for administering your database, but if that login was to get compromised, or if you use that login for your website, then they have access to every single bit of data you have in that MySQL instance or your Postgre instance or whatever.